Hi, everyone. This is the second of 3 sessions as part of what we call the crisis cycle. For those who have maybe not been here last week, this is the we had a kind of a first introductory session. This is a series of 3 open sessions over Tuesday lunchtime. The final one will be next week. Last week, we briefly touched upon how the climate crisis that we have been increasingly discussing in general in society, but also at the AA and in architectural education, is in our reading structurally connected to a crisis at the level of the political economy. And we want to have a series of 3 sessions on specifically the political economic conditions within which we exist that establish clear frameworks and limits for what possible practices can happen, and how ultimately we hope we can explore how possibly just talking about changing practices may not be sufficient. We need to talk also about addressing and changing the political economic conditions within which we do those practices. We started this with an introductory session last week. Today, we're going to be talking about this category, the New Deal, which is probably the central category that everyone tends to think these problems around. And next week, the long run, we'll deal with what we believe are some limitations of the New Deal framework from the Marxist perspective. Also, this Friday, we'll have a symposium starting at 3 in the afternoon, going up till, I think it's only up till 8. I don't think it's up till 8:30. But Radical Reform Revolution, it's a weird, slightly later than usual because we have several speakers from the US. We need to cater to their time zones too. So we're all very welcome there. We will discuss the intersection between precisely this issue of what are we talking about when we discuss alternative forms of practice, and how does that relate to needing to talk about alternative forms or alternative conditions for that practice to be possible. So today, New Deals. We will really, in last week, we introduced this category of the Green New Deal, of course. I mean, everyone is familiar with it at this point. It's a dominant framework for thinking about these issues. We are not really going to be talking that much about the Green New Deal. If you want to have a fairly comprehensive reading of what the Green New Deal entails and how it connects to architecture, we would probably recommend that you check out the talk by Billy Fleming, given here at the AA. At the end of last February, I think. It's definitely kind of a fairly comprehensive reading of this. So go and check that out. It's on the AA YouTube platform at this point. What we want to talk about is the New Deal as a general framework. So we usually talk about, and we can see here, essentially when we talk about the Green New Deal, we're talking about kind of infrastructural projects, as we can see from this series of posters, propaganda posters, which you can even see is essentially playing on a kind of nostalgia effect for the historical New Deal in the US. The historical New Deal in the US, as I'm sure all of you know, is a series of economic reform policies and strategies to create economic recovery after the crash of 1929. It is usually associated with large-scale infrastructural projects as well. The trick in the Green New Deal is that these infrastructural projects are about transitioning from one form of energy production to a sustainable form of energy production. But essentially, we'll be talking more about the political economic structure of what a New Deal is in general terms, and in broader terms, even than just the American New Deal, right? The American New Deal has a lot of infrastructure projects. Certainly, it was crucially important. It is a big part of the creation of government jobs of the New Deals of the post-32 period. It is connected also to kind of the construction of basic kind of national scale infrastructural logics that are not just at the level of building things. You can say the presence of the mailman here is like the hero of the New Deal, gives you an idea of what government jobs also entails. It's also the creation of a national logic of like state-run public mail system that normalizes mail delivery and across the country. This is a very important part of New Dealer policies that is also absolutely crucial and taken to a significantly larger extent in the European equivalent of this, which usually the usual term for this is the construction of the welfare state. European welfare states are to a significant extent more kind of all-encompassing than the American New Deal. And to a certain extent, we even think that it's probably a good idea to de-Americanize these discussions, not let them be overly framed just by the New Deal logic, without even needing to go into a Marxist critique of the New Deal. The European welfare state is significantly more aggressive, especially in the way in which it creates a very large public sector of the economy and then kind of an overarching system of public services that are run by the state and are therefore taken away from capitalist commoditization. And in this series of 3 propaganda posters during World War II, in which essentially the British government was telling the brave soldiers fighting the Nazis is, well, you beat the Nazis, and if you do that, you come back home, and this is what you're going to get, right? We're going to rebuild the country according to this new set of principles in which there will be universal free access to housing, education, this is a school, and healthcare, this is a healthcare center. These are buildings that existed already. They were paradigmatic examples of early modernist architecture in Britain, and they were associated to this logic of constructing a new, fairer, better society, where the entirety of the population, and particularly the working classes, would have a significantly increased material conditions of life, offered by a kind of a process of reorganizing the production and distribution of wealth in society within the market logic through state regulation and through the construction of large-scale social public systems. The fundamental 4 pillars of the economy of the fundamental 4 pillars of a welfare state economy usually tends to be the public education system, the public healthcare system, social security, retirement, guaranteed retirement for everybody, and of course housing as well. You can see here that architecture is a very significant component of the 3 of these 4. Of course, these appears, as we know, and this reason why we are discussing this in the current moment. We have been discussing the issue of like New Deal, what a New Deal could be, and what the reconstruction of the welfare state could be. We have been discussing this for a significant time now, not just in the context of the Green New Deal, but since the crash of 2008, right? This has been on the table, not necessarily associated just with the environmental, the urgent need for a reform of our economic system to be environmentally sustainable. The need for reconstructing, to go back to a kind of welfare state models / New Deal models, away from what is usually called neoliberalism, has been very much on the table. We had, just as the New Deals and welfare states in the collective West, I might call it that, appeared as an attempt to move forward from the crash of 1929. We are now dealing with a crash of 2008, when Lehman Brothers collapsed under the weight of what is usually like toxic funds. When there was a realization that the debt bubble of the neoliberal economy could not really be sustained anymore. In 1929, the fundamental, like the massive amount of social problems that were created after the crash, essentially, it is when the kind of growing spiral of the capitalist economy suddenly reverses course. Instead of a continuous expansion, it starts moving backwards. And you have what is usually called an economic recession or depression. In this case, this was called the Great Depression. Just like the current condition in which we are is usually called the Great Recession. We're not going to go into the difference between the depression and the recession. But the situation in which you are found is that the economy is essentially run by the financial sector. All investment depends on credit, from the financial sector. There's a moment which is called, what we usually call the crash, when the financial sector cannot or like realizes that there is no possibility of paying back any of the existing. There is no possibility of maintaining profit seeking on the basis of issuing credit, because no credit will ever be paid back. It ceases to issue credit. That's the crash of the financial markets. Because there's no credit, no one can invest. All companies in the productive sector of the economy go bankrupt. Everyone is unemployed. No one has money to consume anything. Because no one has money to consume anything, there's even less desire to invest. And so there's a kind of a cycle of economic collapse that cannot be reversed merely through the usual free market mechanisms. And so there is this need for some kind of state intervention. This is not achieved. And originally I had picked that kind of more kind of cliche image that everyone has already seen of like people in a food line trying to get something from the government, some kind of free soup, right, for people who were chronically unemployed. And I switched to this image because I think it's very important to understand that this did not come about, the existence of the past New Deals and welfare states did not come about because like good, nice president, federal, like FDR, decides that the workers are suffering too much, and the government, led by nice people, starts producing this kind of reform against the interests of capitalist monopolies in favor of common people. That's not how it works. That's not how it worked in the past. There was massive social issues that created massive organization of the labor movement. Trade unionists, socialists, and communists organized and created immense pressures from below to force the government, either in the American New Deal or in the European welfare states, to created massive amounts of pressure in order to get these reforms enacted. And of course, you have the geopolitical dimension of this, in which you had at the time the threat of revolution looming on the horizon. The Soviet Union had, not too long ago, just in 1917, it's 12 years before 1929, overtaken, destroyed an entire state and taken over the state and constructed what was perceived then as the real threat of socialist revolution. And so capitalist regimes in the West had a significant incentive by way of being scared to produce these reforms, right? We have not had the same amount of pressure today. There has not been a New Deal or a reconstruction of the welfare state in Europe. We have had significant amounts of popular participation and demonstration, organization, etc., in many ways since the crisis of 2008, but it clearly has not been sufficient. And we still don't really have a set of policies that mimic what the policies that were done after 29, as a response to 29. And we are here, even to a certain extent, being a bit generous about what 29 was, but we will be dealing with that further next week. This is a demonstration in Lisbon. I'm in that demonstration. I'm in there somewhere. I think I was near the central statue. This was a series of mass demonstrations in Portugal in the Troika period of implemented austerity. This one, run by the trade unionist movement, this one I think had gathered about 500,000 people in Lisbon. It completely paralyzed the entire city. And it was only one of like several. I think it was like 4 national demonstrations, close to 500,000 people just in that year of 2012. Okay, so what are we talking about when we are talking about the reconstruction of the welfare state or / New Deals? And as opposed to what has been the response that we've been having up till now for the post-2008 crisis condition. I'm sure that most of you in here will probably have heard of this debate between demand-side economics and supply-side economics. That's usually the terminology used to distinguish these two positions. In the first session of this cycle, we talked about the difference between the what we call the kind of tradition of political economy and economics. And we effectively framed it as basically being almost 2 different disciplines. The discipline of political economy evolves during the 19th century. It goes basically all the way to Marx. Marx functions simultaneously as a kind of the greatest political economist, but also as a critic of the discipline of political economy, and it sort of breaks it in a certain way. This is also at a time like around the 1870s when there is a significant crisis of the capitalist system. It's essentially the beginning of the state of structural crisis of capitalism that we're still living today. It's a more than 100 years old problem. And bourgeois political economy that are confronted by Marx with the conclusion coming from their own field that capitalism is unsustainable, abandon the field of political economy and create the field of economics, right? The field of economics is different from the field of political economy in the sense that political economy focuses on production and economics focuses on trade and essentially mechanisms of consumption. And reads the problem through supply and demand, a balance between supply and demand. Both Keynes and Friedman here, both Keynesian economics, or the economics of the welfare state or of social democracy, and the economics of neoliberalism, both exist within the field of economics. These are 2 approaches that bourgeois economics develop to try and essentially find a way around the structural problem in capitalism. We are not going to be developing this here. We can only understand this problem by looking at it through the eyes of Marxism. So again, this is going to be discussed next week. But the key thing here is both of these people, both of these gentlemen here agree that the problem exists on the supply to demand balance, right? And how do you deal with the problem when there is an imbalance, when there is too much supply for the demand that exists, by which we mean demand is consumers consuming. There is no money to consume. People cannot consume enough. There's too much stuff being sold for what people can sell. The crisis is perceived as a crisis of overproduction or of underconsumption. You can address this problem by essentially creating more demand, finding ways to do that, or by fixing the problem on the supply side. What does this mean in concrete terms? And this is the debate between Keynesian economics and neoclassical economics that people like Friedman and others, Friedman is probably the greatest name, as he's been directly influential in the construction of neoliberal policies ever since the 1970s. The welfare state approach to this, as Keynes frames it, is relatively straightforward. I think it's easy to understand. People don't have money to buy things. Capitalism has having some difficulties in starting to cut wages, create unemployment, and that because there is no incentive to investment, and that creates even less incentives to investment, blah, 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 spiral of recession. How do you do that? The government intervenes and gives money to the consumers. It just gives money to the people who will buy the things, right? If there is enough, if people have more money to buy things, capitalist investors will start investing because they know that they will be able to sell them in the future. So whatever they produce, commodities and services and etc., there will be a market to buy it. And so essentially there's this notion that you can just start creating public investment. The state creates money or taxes the wealthy to send it to the workers, by therefore increasing the consumption capacity of the workforce. This is achieved through diverse mechanisms of market regulation and state intervention of the economy. But this is the gist of the idea. Keynes is significantly, or rather, the Keynesian welfare states, or diverse forms of welfare state that exist in Europe, are significantly more complicated than just the New Deal in America, precisely because they create extra mechanisms of producing consumption capacity by just creating a public sector in education, for example, is a way of giving money to people indirectly. If they don't have to pay for school, they have school free. They have the money that they would pay for their children to go into university is instead spent on other things. So that it's also an indirect way of creating more consumption power. You may have heard of the concept of the social salary, the social wage. It's kind of the overall consumption capacity. This works and defines the logic of New Deals and welfare states. The development of neoliberal economics, with Friedman as at the head of the construction of neoliberal policy after the 70s, is what you do instead, you leave the market to grow in and of itself, no regulation. And what we do is increase the liquidity of essentially the credit sector, the financial sector, in order to maintain the possibility of banks to lend to investors in the productive economy, so that the investors can create jobs, and so it would. The notion is that the economy grows better if you, instead of giving money to workers / consumers, you give money to banks to create more credit, like more and more credit, so that investment grows in that way. There is a periodization here, obviously. Keynes is trying to solve a certain crisis. Friedman is trying to solve a different crisis. But essentially, I think it's possible to frame what Friedman is doing, the development of neoliberal economics, as essentially a kind of a rehash and continuation of the neoclassical economics that developed in the late 19th century. The notion is the free market tends towards balance, tends towards equilibrium. It self-regulates. I assume we all heard this terminology, self-regulation of the markets. Now, of course, the problem is that confronted with the crisis of 2008, it's obviously clear that the markets don't self-regulate. To such an extent that the policies had to drastically change, right? A major part of what neoliberalism is doing between the 1970s and 2008, apart from the issue I've already described and cutting on public services, and instead introducing mechanism of deficit control, privatizing public sectors to inject that area of the economy into the private market to create more sources of profit. A major part of what this represents economically is essentially the replacement of salaries with credit. Over time, you have a kind of a stagnation of wages. This is deliberately planned in order to make labor cheaper. Making labor cheaper is part of the mechanisms of stimulating the economy under the neoliberal format. If you're an investor and you have to pay less to your workers, your investment has a higher profitability. However, if the workers get paid less, they can't spend that money on consumption, therefore creating the underconsumption problem that leads to crisis. So how do you solve that? You give money to the workers in the future. Workers can buy stuff today with future money, not money that they are paid now, but money that they are sort of told that they can get, that they will eventually get in the future. That is what credit is. And what this creates is the debt bubble, as we understand it, that has been created since the 70s till 2008. In 1980, the amount of debt in advanced economies was 68% of the combined GDP of the advanced economies. In 2007, the year before the crisis, it was 438 of the gross domestic product. So the amount of debt that exists in society skyrockets over time, because that is the only way of workers whose wages have stagnated to continue purchasing things to keep the economy rolling. And therefore, the economy is predicated on an exponential expansion of the debt markets. Just in housing, which is particularly important for the system and for us architects, just mortgages, housing credit, in 2007 was 67% of the GDP of the UK. 67% of the GDP of the UK was just existed in formal, or rather, the amount of money in the debt market just in the housing sector was 67% of the entire economy of the United Kingdom. Just to realize of the immense amounts of crazy money being produced through debt. Of course, like Friedman didn't see the end result of his policies. He died in 2006, just 2 years before the crash. When he died, everything was fine, right? Just like Keynes also died in 46. Keynes also died before seeing the full results of his policy proposals. He died as the welfare state in Europe was being constructed, was beginning to be constructed to the scale that it was. And indeed, when Friedman died in 2006, he thought everything was fine. He was looking at this, and what he was seeing was what neoliberal economists described as the boom. The boom is the rise in prices of housing assets and the assets related to housing, financial assets relating to housing, bonds and mortgages and etc. Or rather, and as you can see here, it's an important relationship. The rise in prices of houses, of homeowners, there was a stimulus for people to buy a house, not just rent a house or not continue to exist in public housing. You've heard of the right to buy under Thatcher. Reagan's policy was identical. But all of these buying and selling of houses in the private market, the home ownership logic, depended on credit, as you can see. Like it's essentially the same graph. These are parallel developments. And what you can see is how the growth in housing mortgages is exactly the same as the rising credit, as the rising prices. There is no rising prices in housing, in the housing sector, that is, in this context, that is not fueled by just issuing credit. It's fictional money. The rising prices are just people who own houses deciding, or people who control the housing market, deciding entirely arbitrarily to raise the prices and then issuing credit to people to be able to match those prices. It is not an organic development in the sense of just like houses are better and therefore more expensive or anything like that. And of course, Friedman dies in 2006. He didn't see what happened next. And what happened next is that this hit a bursting point. The financial markets realized that all of this debt that was being created to feed the rising housing prices wasn't payable. The families that were contracting these debts will never be able to pay these debts. And this reached a point where even the markets that had all the interest in pretending that wasn't the case realized that it was inevitable. And usually what the expression that we hear a lot is there was a crisis of confidence in the markets. The market ceased to have confidence that in the future they would get all of their investments repaid, because they wouldn't. But it was never the point to get their investments repaid. The point is to maintain the cycle of the growing credit bubble, and as long as it keeps growing, there is no problem. The problem, of course, is that at that moment there was because of a series of a specific thing that happened inside Lehman Brothers, where a certain group of very rich people realized that they would not get their return on the funds, on the housing mortgage funds that they had invested. They would not get that money back. there was a kind of a little blimp, a little like a little a hiccup in the spiral of growing financial assets. And just that deceleration of growth is enough to send the entire system tumbling down. It needs to, the stock assets related to housing needs to increase their value every day at an exponential rate, as the graph basically demonstrates. And if it stops growing at the necessary rate, it's not about normalizing and reducing and the value of the assets lowering. It's just not growing fast enough is enough to throw the entire system into total disarray, which is what happened in 2008. But of course,
just a quick time check. Quick time check. Okay. You're at 30 minutes.
Yeah, God. And so what we have is now massive regrowth of this logic, right? The problem was solved by way of injecting money into the economy, as happened in the post-2008 logic. So after 2008, neoliberal policies are not really just neoliberal policies anymore. There's they exist in kind of a strict contradiction. Milton Friedman is now dead and a ghost and is going into heaven. But the economy still functions according to the fundamental according to the fundamental interests that his policies were defending, the interests of the financial monopoly capitalist class. But just implementing his policies is no longer sufficient. Just cutting public spending is not possible. This is not solving the problem. And so what you have, and you may have heard the expression of quantitative easing Keynesianism. You have a series of economists who kind of define themselves as neo-Keynesian. And they are Keynesian in the sense that, like Keynes and against Friedman, they think that the state needs to create money and invest money into the economy directly, direct public investment into the economy, right? However, completely unlike Keynes, they don't think that that money should be invested and given to consumers. It is to be given to the same people that Milton Friedman wanted to help, the financial class. And so what you have to respond as a response to the 2008 crisis is the creation of insanely huge amounts of money by the states, by the Western neoliberal states. They all create all of this money and just give it to the banks, essentially, through specific mechanisms like buying bonds and etc. It doesn't matter. That's what it's called, quantitative easing. But the point is issuing money and injecting it into finance, hoping that we can rescue the profit rates of the financial speculative economy so that it can continue to speculate. But now increasingly, obviously, at the expense of the real economy. So we have cuts in public spending for public services on the one side, but massive public spending to save the banks. We have continued privatization of the public sectors and services, but we have effectively what it constitutes a nationalization of the private debt of the financial sector. And we have not just wage stagnation, but wage contraction, and an even larger credit bubble going on and on, and what we usually associate with what we usually call today austerity policies. And the consequences of these are very clear. Just in the UK, in 2008, banks were given around £500 billion. Between 2009 and 2019, around $10 trillion of quantitative easing were injected into the financial market just between the US Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan. And on the social, on the real economy side, on like where real people live side, in 2018, just in 1 year, the bottom 20% earners in the UK, their income dropped by 1.6%, while the top 20%, the income of the top 20% income earners rose 4.7%. 4 million children now live in poverty in the UK, and the homelessness numbers doubled between 2010 and 2016. And rose 65%, the number of homeless children, to what was in 2016, 123,000. If you want to understand more how all of this, kind of how the crash and the crisis works, strongly recommend checking out Grace Blakely's works. Grace Blakely will be here on Friday speaking to us in our symposium, so we'll be able to hear it from her. And so how does this apply to architecture? I think it's kind of important to understand how, like, the radical change that this entails. During the welfare state period, architecture was doing stuff like this. It was part of the process of public investment to create a social wage, to guarantee increased consumption power, and part of that was giving people free housing. In 1968, 150,000, just in that year, 150,000 dwellings were created by the public sector. In 1992, 25,000 were created. There was a massive cut that corresponds essentially with the Thatcherite turn. And what architecture started doing in the neoliberal turn was, instead of doing public housing, it had to be part of a public logic of promoting the private sector. So you have architecture doing private sector housing, increasingly over time for a richer section of the population, for middle class, upper middle class, upper middle class. As time goes on, the market that manages to survive is higher and higher. And their public architecture is producing this kind of Bilbao effect, large scale kind of cultural venue objects that increase the value of the land around them in order to increase even public projects are meant to serve the increasing prices of the housing market. After 2008, the financial markets are no longer dependent on the housing market because they're just getting quantitative easing, direct capital from the government. So architecture doesn't need to do anything anymore, really. The projects that you end up having, the star system logic that we inherited from the neoliberal period, is now producing, and there's a handful of very star system-y architects producing these kind of architectures that they don't even need to make sense anymore. They don't even need to be for rich people. They just need to exist to be included as part of the financial assets of whatever mortgage, like hedge fund, owns them. They don't need to be adequate for anyone living there. They don't need to make sense as a physical object. They just exist as a financial asset. And so a handful of star system architects are increasingly making increasingly dumb, useless architectures. And the vast majority of architects are increasingly unemployed because there's no market to buy anything, including houses. Just in 2009, the year after the crash in the UK, unemployment claims by architects rose by 760%. Of course, this was kind of normalized after that. Between 2010 and 2015, the number of architecture jobs fell in the UK from 62,500 to 49,200. And just in London, 22,500 to 12,200. Basically, in London, it was basically reduced to slightly above half. There has been a partial recovery between 2015 and now, but we still live in the exact same situation. And in the current moment where we have the Corona crash pending, looming on the horizon, the economic effects of what the current moment the economic effects that are going to come from the current moment are going to be probably significantly larger than what 2008 represented. And so that is the condition in which we exist today. Thanks. Sorry for being so long.
Thanks. So I suppose last week we had kind of like discussion break between presentations and broke it into kind of like two halves with a presentation in each half. I think maybe we'll just go right into the second presentation and then talk about it all together. What do you think?
I don't mind if there are questions and people want to address some of the issues that they're, we can.
I think because of the time, we can keep going beyond 1 o'clock, but some people may have to return to classes and things at 2 o'clock. So why don't we do the other presentation now just to make sure everybody can see that, and then we'll do Q&A. And there's a question in the chat about uploading, whether this will be uploaded, and it will. So this will be on the YouTube channel, the AA's YouTube channel, to watch later.
Okay, let's see if I can try to share my screen. I failed last time, so let's see if I can do that. Just bear with me for a moment, sorry. If you need a drink, now till I try to. It's time for a drink. Okay, just a moment. Can you see something? No, not yet. Okay. Okay, can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Because I don't have a view of you while I'm presenting, I can only see the slides. So if there's a problem, a glitch or anything, or you cannot hear me, try to speak to me because I cannot see you. Don't wave. Okay. Yeah. So, okay, I will look more into the different crises of capitalism and specifically discuss a bit more of the welfare state. As Ricardo showed, and also we discussed last week, despite the belief of neoclassical economics in the equilibrium of markets, this is rarely achieved. I think Ricardo demonstrated that very clearly. Markets are experiencing the one crisis after the other. It can only be useful to go back to history to show that crises have in fact been inherent in capitalism, independently of the supply and demand policies that are applied. Industrial capitalism developed in most European countries and the US since the mid-18th century and was sustained by industrial revolution, international free trade, the development of finance and credit systems backed by central banking and monetary policies. Industrial capitalism reached a critical point with the first crisis of 1873, which triggered what was called the Long Depression in Western European countries and the US, and lasted till the end of the 19th century. In order to sustain the necessary labor force and address this crisis, some proto-welfare state policies were initiated in the late 19th century. The first to introduce insurance programs for workers against sickness, accident, and old age was the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who aimed to cultivate workers' loyalty and increase productivity through a series of measures. In Britain, a series of liberal reforms in the early 20th century came to update the existing poor laws and address the social and economic inequalities that were caused by capitalism. Till then, unemployment, sickness, and poverty were attended by church and charity, while the reception of relief was to be earned by living and working in workhouses under extremely difficult conditions. So basically, you had to earn your welfare in the 19th century, and I think this is what we are. It's kind of happening at the moment as well. In parallel, from the end of the 19th century, efforts were made to clear the slums and provide decent housing conditions for the working classes. The first scheme to provide social housing in Britain was realized in Liverpool in 1869, followed by the Boundary Estate in London in 1900. However, the actual changes in housing conditions started taking place after World War I, when councils were required to provide housing through the use of subsidies. So the state would subsidize the provision of housing. Despite these first efforts to address the negative effects of capitalist development, the situation worsened after another economic crisis, the famous crash of 1929 that Ricardo also discussed. In the aftermath of the Wall Street and London Exchange stock market crisis, US and the industrialized world fell into what was called the Great Depression, lasting till 1939, so the outbreak of the Second World War. The deepest and longest economic depression in the history of the Western industrialized world up to the time, and which was characterized by high unemployment and poverty. There are three main economic theories developed regarding the reasons of Great Depression: the monetarist, the Austrian economic school, and the Keynesian approach. The first two are quite similar. The monetarist approach claims that the crash was caused by banking crises that led to monetary contraction, while the economists of the Austrian school also considered as a main cause the initial expansion of money supply, which led to an economic bubble and eventually to a credit crisis in banks. The explanation, which was proposed by John Keynes, is that the reduction in consumption led to deflation and loss of investments, which made holding money more profitable and therefore increased the economic recession as the circulation of money was limited. So people preferred to hold money than spend money, and this would cause the crisis. Following this observation, Keynes, in the General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, that was published in 1936, developed an approach of how to reform capitalism through the implementation of demand-side policies. According to Keynes, the lower aggregate expenditures and the collective non-investment, as we said, it can lead to economy operating in low levels, and leading to the decline of income and unemployment, an increase in unemployment. Keynes advocated for an active response by public sector to influence aggregate demand and sustain high levels of supply and demand, which would also guarantee employment. So active fiscal and monetary policies are the primary tools recommended by Keynesian economics to intervene in the economy. Keynesian economic theory has been put in practice in many countries through the implementation of economic and social policies, which rely on state intervention and planning. One of the most well-known examples, and the one that Ricardo mentioned as well, was the New Deal, which was a series of programs, public works projects, financial reforms, and regulations put forward by President Roosevelt in response to the Great Depression. The New Deal was also, as we said, partial implementation of Keynesian policies. The program aimed at the relief of unemployed and poor, the recovery of the economy, and the reform of the financial system. So what is important is that Roosevelt's New Deal gave form to a New Deal coalition, which lasted till the 1960s in US. At the end of the Second World War, a series of organizations were also put in place in order to regulate economic and military relations between countries. Most notably, the Bretton Woods system, which established the rules for commercial and financial relations, with a requirement for each country to maintain its exchange rates tied to gold. So basically, you could not, the countries were they had to back their exchange rate with gold, so the fluctuation of rates was not possible. The second most well-known example of the application of Keynesian economic policies can be found in the post-war reconstruction of European countries and the formation of the welfare states, where there was a clear state intervention, a regulation of markets, planning of the economy to sustain high demand and full employment. The emergence of the welfare state can be considered as the result of the negotiation of the economic and social balances between the different economic classes. It is an attempt to diminish the economic gaps through the socialization of consumption. And in a sense, it is a compromise that would avoid any form of uprise of the working classes, counterweight to the inequalities, the destructive effects produced by capitalism. One can distinguish between four different welfare state models: the liberal, the continental, the social democratic, and the southern, the one applied in Mediterranean countries. One of the best examples of the application of Keynesian economic policies in the formation of the welfare state can be found in Britain. A cross-party political consensus was formed in Britain after World War II that lasted till the advent of Margaret Thatcher. which agreed on the importance of the welfare provisions, the maintenance of full employment, and of social security. So there was an agreement that high state expenditure and the regulation of the economy based on Keynesian principles were necessary in order to sustain the economic growth. The formation of the welfare state relied on the proposals of the Beveridge report and was initiated by the Labour government of Clement Attlee through a series of acts. So between 1945 and 1951, the Labour government put forward a series of acts that formed the British welfare state. First of all, national insurance became compulsory with the National Insurance Acts. The National Healthcare System was established with the National Health Service Act and made possible the provision of medical care to all. A series of education acts made education compulsory and free. The housing white papers that were published in 1945 addressed the problems of housing and living conditions through the construction of shelters and temporary housing, while the New Towns Act and the Town and Planning Act of 1946 and 1947 made necessary the permission and an increased tax for any land development, transferring the control and the regulation of land from local planning authorities. So between 1945 and 1951, really private building was not promoted. It was mainly the building was done by the state, and land use was controlled. That changed when the Conservatives came to power in 1951. So through the building of new towns, housing, schools, and later of hospitals and universities, the British state initiated the largest part of architectural construction. The central and local governments were merely responsible for the majority of building production, while the use of land as well as the development of industries were under state regulation and ministerial planning. It was through these public building programs that modernism was also established in Britain. In most of these cases, these projects were planned, designed, and built by local councils and under the supervision of ministries. Architectural departments were created in most of the ministries, and by the 1960s, around 50% of the architects in Britain were employed directly or indirectly by the state. So here you can see a difference between what Ricardo showed at the end and what was happening in the 60s. So the welfare states, through the state intervention and the realization of the public welfare programs, achieved an expansion of citizenship, not only to include civil and political rights, but also to include social rights. With the control of land and housing, it repressed the price of rents. And most importantly, through the welfare provisions, and the control of private enterprises, it achieved the commodification of certain domains of life, while the socialization of consumption sustained high demand and achieved full employment. And this actually worked for a while, for a period of 30 years, which was called the golden age of capitalism by the historians. However, by the beginning of the 1970s, this model of capitalist development also reached its limitations. It became apparent that there was a crisis which was manifested with increased public debt and stagflation in most Western countries, so stable wages but high inflation. The end of Bretton Woods system that allowed the fluctuation of exchange rates increased the problem, and the oil crisis of 1973 and the increased criticism of state intervention marked this shift in policies and in attitude towards planning economy. This shift was realized by the advent to power by a series of neoliberal politicians, most notably of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who introduced market-oriented reform policies following the monetarist economic theories of Friedman the elimination of market control as proposed by Friedrich Hayek, leading to the deregulation of markets and the withdrawal of public social provisions. And this resulted to the dissolution of the existing welfare states and the popularization of the ideology of enterprise, free competition, and self-regulation. Of course, as Ricardo discussed, this approach also reached its end with the crisis of 2008. So the inability of both Keynesian and neoliberal economic policies to avoid the crisis of capitalism is explained by Marx, and this was what we will try to discuss next week. I think what we tried to show here in these presentations was how both systems, the supply side system and the demand side system of trying to change the economy didn't really work. Yeah. So thank you for me, and then we'll discuss more about that next week. So I don't know if we have any questions or would like to.
Yeah, if you have a question, you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you, or feel free to put a question in the chat and we can read it out.
Or comments, not everything.
Or comments, yeah.
Question.
I can just start out by saying that in what we've covered this week, there are a number of contradictions. We're trying to cover it as a kind of compromise because we have a different reading of what's going on structurally from the perspective of Marxian political economy than these theories that we're describing say. So we're trying to represent what like a Keynesian policy approach would be, or how it understands an economic crisis. We're trying to describe to a certain extent what the neoliberal perception is, what a supply side approach to crisis would be. We're trying to generalize a bit. There are differences between like strict Keynesian approaches and other approaches. Like even within Europe, Germany had different policies that were Keynesian until the 60s, I think, late 60s, maybe even. But we're trying not to get lost in all that detail and trying just to present a fairly quick intro to thinking about the New Deal, thinking about the welfare state. Okay, we've got a question here in the chat. I'll read it out. This is a question from Renzo. Could you explain a little bit further the notion and concept of financial architecture after the 2008 crisis? Thank you. Thanks, Renzo. Rick, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, sure. But yeah, like I was before doing that, just kind of to emphasize Will's just final point. Yeah, like we are basically trying to explain Keynesianism and neoliberalism more or less from like a Keynesian perspective today, but we actually think Keynes is wrong. Usually when we have this discussed, when this is discussed pretty much anywhere, it tends to be Keynesianism or neo-Keynesianism takes versus neoliberalism. And everyone making this discussion is usually a Keynesian in some way, shape, or form. We are not. But we don't want to discuss that problem today, obviously. From our perspective, essentially, both neoliberalism and Keynesianism are byproducts of structural trends that exist in capitalism that can only be understood through Marxism. Yeah, the issue of financial architecture, it's not that architecture is financial itself, I guess. It's that like the social function of architecture between the 1970s and 2008, like increasingly over time, obviously, this is a kind of a constant progressive transformation. But the fundamental social function of architecture is to increase the prices. That is the core macroeconomic policy of neoliberal economics, is to increase prices of like financial assets related to housing. And architecture itself, it's trying to sort that out. the emphasis is moved away from utility of the object increasingly over time into the trade value of the object. This is also something that through Marx is better understandable. The difference between exchange value and use value. Complicated concepts. Use value increasingly becomes less and less important over time. Exchange value is important. Exchange value means that the financial markets want to increase the nominal value of the financial assets that they have, bonds, the hedge funds, etc., by way of raising the prices of the houses that are included in that fund, that are the property of that fund, or rather, whose mortgages are the property of that fund. The policy up till 2008 is architecture functioning as a creation of a sort of visual surplus value for the housing developments themselves, and the creation of increased prices in real estate land around through what is usually understood called the Bilbao effect architectures. Everyone has heard the term Bilbao effect, right? This is what Bilbao effect means. It's gentrification. That's what gentrification means. You do a thing that is like flashy and is a public, expensive piece of public architecture. It counts as public investment, but it isn't producing directly the use of the houses that people will use. It is producing an increase in the prices in the land area, the urban areas around it, as like the redevelopment projects, etc. Now, the 2008 crisis transforms the situation because up till then, banks wanted the houses to actually be bought by someone. And increasingly, that someone had to be more and more rich, right? But in 2008, they ceased to believe that they will actually sell what they are producing. The houses are not to be sold anymore. They don't need to be sold anymore. No one believes they will be sold anymore. Sold in the sense of the mortgages will be repaid. No one believes that will happen. That is what the crash is. The crash is when the financial markets realize that the mortgages will never be paid. And so they find another source of money, which is just the state printing money and giving it to the banks. If the state is printing money and giving it to the banks, there's no need to sell houses anymore. And so there's no need to build houses anymore, which means that architects are all out of a job. And in the meantime, the only architectures that are done are some kind of flashy objects that, again, do not need to be used by anyone. They just need to exist as trade value. They just need to exist as a fictional object that is exchanged in the stock market between different capitalists, financial capitalists. It doesn't need to have any concrete expression in society at the level of people actually living in the buildings, which is why so many of the incredibly expensive high-end flats being built today in Elephant and Castle and like all over London in general are not being, no one lives in them. They are bought by hedge funds, not by people who actually want to live in them, right? That's what I suppose financial architecture is.
I think I could just add, following up on Rick said, that we will try to go into more detail on use value and exchange value next week, which is really like, I mean, the previous session and this session, we're kind of just trying to get to next week's session when we try to actually make sense of what we're talking about. When we go back to production, try to understand the role of production, try to figure out a better theory of crises, and then talk again about the role of architecture and political struggle. Renzo's asking, he's saying, thank you, super interesting. Do you have any books to recommend on that? Rick, the Grace Blakely books.
Go and read Grace. Grace is incredibly good at explaining the problem to like lay people. I don't think there's anyone better than her explaining this for people who are not in actual economics. Go check out these two books that in the other slide. The Stolen and the Corona Crash.
And make sure you join us on Friday when she'll be back. Yeah, this and the Philip Mesco recommends The City by Tony Norfield. Yeah, that's a great recommendation.
Of course, on the side of how architecture shifts to become like what this fake architecture sort of architecture for finance or purely for finance detached from use, what that means in the 2000s, I don't think there's much making this reading out there.
There was at the Dundee AHRA conference a couple years ago, Rainier de Graaf gave a talk. I think we tried to use the building that he used in his talk, which was, one of these ultra slender Manhattan skyscrapers, basically a residential tower that's completely empty of occupation, just being sold as a financial asset. And de Graaf commented on what a sorry state of affairs architecture had become when it no longer had use value and was purely an elite asset for speculation. And sitting in the audience, his comment seemed incredibly ironic, since this dynamic is basically what Koolhaas had championed in an early version of this dynamic is what Koolhaas had championed in Delirious New York. And de Graaf, of course, worked at AMO with Koolhaas. So what is now the contradictions of a certain format for architectural practice, which in the postmodern era after the welfare state decline really depended on real estate speculation, and Koolhaas is the theorist of this transition, is now perceived as people even within that own circle as like kind of a disastrous turn of events. Is really, really interesting, really ironic.
Yeah, and on how architecture expresses and it functions essentially as kind of an outcome of political economic conditions. Like we're architects. Obviously, we believe that architects are kind of producing the architecture of the future, right? And that's true to an extent. We're all kind of trying to come up with the new forms and solutions for the problems as that they are perceived. But it's also not true in the sense that architecture just functions as an outcome of something deeper. And to a certain extent, I think it's important that we think of architects as basically a whole bunch of idiots who are all like throwing clay at the wall, trying to come up with their the project of the future. But it is the political economic conditions that determine which clay actually gets glued, which clay works and which clay doesn't, right? The wall that we are throwing clay at is the political economy. And modernism, and the architecture of the welfare state in general terms, was invented by architects, but it worked because there was a political economic need for it, in which it made sense. It was the organic, natural expression in the built environment of that political economic period. In neoliberalism, the conditions are different, and so architecture transformed itself. And in the 2008, after the 2008 period, it transformed even more into being even more bad than before. So it's important to always read, at the same time that we're proposing projects for the future and forms of practice for the future, to read how those forms function in reality as an expression of the political economic foundations on which they work, right? And it's that type of reading that we're trying to produce here that is probably going to be significantly more present. The disciplinary side, the architecture side, is going to be more present in the symposium, I think, than in these lunchtime sessions.
Yeah, I would just quickly follow up on that in Koolhaas's writing, he's looking at Manhattan basically before the crash. The crash comes in for a brief mention in one section, and he asks a question like Delirious New York, Manhattanism, the incredible growth of real estate ballooning lower Manhattan. He's kind of asking, why did we ever get away from that? He's recovering a history that he thinks has been forgotten or suppressed. Obviously, it's been forgotten because it failed and was replaced by a far more expansive and successful era, both in terms of living standards and even for capitalism, more productive under the welfare state. So his theory only makes sense in a return to the speculative policies, more or less, of the pre-New Deal. So he's articulating that connection between the neoliberal post-welfare state and the pre-New Deal. And his history framing of architecture basically excludes all of modernism and all of the welfare state.
By the way, I just want to say that you can speak. Like, if you want to, if the audience wants to talk, it's very easy for us to just unmute you instead of having just, from our side, today we're getting the feeling that we're just talking to some pieces of text.
There is a question in the chat. So,
yeah,
Agnes, would you like to? Oh, yeah. Angus, would you like to say the question instead of me reading it, or do you want me to read it? Oh, I can read it. Okay, so it says moving forward, it's a matter of. Okay, yeah. Moving forward, it's a matter of attacking these problems from a more vernacular or universal position. So, for example, the financial models and real estate markets here in Australia have notable differences to those. So, for example, in Europe, is there an all-inclusive approach to the problems of finalized housing and land, or is it a matter of reacting to individual context? So basically the question is, if it is a universal, if there is a universal answer, or it is individual, and if it is an issue of attacking through a vernacular or universal position.
Do you want to try to answer that?
Well, in general, my approach is both in research, but in any problem, it's more to try to analyze the forces of each one of the fields. So basically, looking at things more locally. But of course, there are forces that I think that transcend. There are universal at the moment, and there are similar systems adopted in different countries, in various countries. So I think they're both. We need to understand the international forces of capitalism and the conditions, but also look at the local conditions in terms of how we can address that and what forces there are to react to the problem, if that makes any sense. Yeah. I
think the key point is that when you use terms like universal and vernacular, or do you mean that in stylistic terms, in design terms, or in material terms, political economic terms? I think Eleni's answer assumes the latter. Yeah, political, economic. So there are definitely different structural and material contexts for these dynamics in different places around the world. Very different, often. In some places, these dynamics don't exist at all right now. But I think in Eleni's presentation, she used a collection of images of welfare state architecture, and the attempt was made not to. I mean, if you do a survey of really existing modernism, basically welfare state public building from the middle of the 20th century, you get a fairly eclectic and vernacular collection of solutions, of architectures. We're not talking about style. We're talking about the political economy of construction and the building industry and the architectural profession within that. So I think in the transition from, like, stylistically, the transition from international style modernism as proposed by Americans to, like, critical regionalism, that was a slight stylistic variation, but it also matched to a different historical context. So the stylistic difference may be a superficial thing, but there was actually a changed political and economic context for critical regionalism as well. So you have to be careful to separate the stylistic question maybe from the actual structural question in political and economic terms. Angus has replied, I was referring to political economic terms. Sorry. Great clarification. Thanks. Yeah, this is something. I mean, this is the trick in architecture, right? Is that these categories are systematically blurred, especially in the postmodern era. And this is, I think, what we're trying to talk about, to try to be able to define what the political and economic conditions are and what their role is.
Ryan, would you like us to unmute you so you can speak a bit? No response. Okay. Okay, so just read your question. You missed the early part of the lecture. When we mentioned that the printing of money in 2008 caused the mortgage crisis because no one wants to get mortgages, where do you foresee the unprecedented printing of the stimulus bill today, which is technically 3 times that of 2008 and its effect on architecture? Yeah, first of all, like the mortgage crisis was not caused by the printing of money in 2008. It's the other way around. Like the mortgage crisis is accumulated during the entirety of the neoliberal period from 70s to 2008. Right? It's the breaking of the mortgage system. It's the mortgage crisis is just the neoliberal framework. And the printing of money in 2008 is an attempt to solve the mortgage crisis, right? And it transforms the period of speculative financial accumulation. It moves it from mortgage money to other forms of money, which is quantitative easing, injecting money into the economy directly from the public coffers without having to go through like any housing, any credit, anything, right? So the problem that we have today, the crisis that we're going to feel now, the Great Depression of 2022, will not be will not have anything to do with the mortgage crisis. That's because money is now no longer in mortgages. That's why architecture becomes like fictional after 2008, because it's no longer about housing credit. The problem that we have today, the debt bubble that it is increasing now, it continues to increase. It continues to serve fundamentally the same logic as far as the financial markets go, but it's no longer mortgage money. It is quantitative easing money. Of course, there's also a mortgage dimension that's been relatively recuperated, but the bulk of the money now no longer depends on housing credits. So what you had in the stimulus bill, what it did was just do what we have already been doing since 2008, but to a larger degree. What we had was printing money and giving it to the banks. The stimulus bill is not just that. Like, if we don't want, I can go into like detail on the policy of the American 2021 stimulus thing, or of the European equivalents. But the core logic maintains the post-2008 logic of just injecting public money into finance. The problem that we're going to have is that there's going to be a massive crisis of consumption, just like the mortgage crisis is a crisis of consumption of housing credit. Housing credit is a commodity that people are buying, and then they stop buying it, right? That's the crash. What we're going to have is a massive crisis of consumption because of the incoming, we're already living through it, but the the COVID quarantine situation maintains a certain, like a lid on top of the crisis, which is like bubbling inside the pressure cooker. When the quarantine goes off in a year, the issue is going to be the economic crisis, and it's going to be bigger than before. The crisis is of consumption in general. Usually when people talk about the current bubble, they don't talk about the housing bubble. They talk about the everything bubble. That's the term that is used. Up till 2008, it was a housing bubble. Now it is the everything bubble. Right? And there is already a massive slump of consumption of everything, and it's going to get worse. And that is the source of the next crash. The effect on architecture is that architecture is going to be even more useless in the future than it is today. Within this current system, architecture can only be useful as part of a solution to the current economic problem. And that solution is not architectural. It exists at the level of the political economy.
Any more questions? Comments? We've got a question from Evie. Is there any point in studying architecture right now? Tough question. And a question from Dorette. Could you maybe speak about the relation between the global systems and how neoliberal policies are used with these systems? Do either of you guys want to take a shot at that tough first question?
You want to go, Eleni?
Where to start?
I mean, to be honest, I would just say yes, but that's nothing to do with the problem, right? Like there is architecture exists in relation to this kind of stuff, to these types of problems, like any other discipline does. Like, is there any other point in studying engineering? Is there any other point? Like, there is a bubble of everything, and there is going to be a crisis of consumption of everything. So is there a point to anything? Yes, because that is the problem of the current political economic framework, is that the foundations of the economy have been completely detached from the real economy. There's a financial speculative economy, and there's the real economy. Everything, the entirety of the real economy is subjugated to the needs of the financial markets. What we just need to do is make it the other way around. And I mean, probably in our position, the financial markets just need to cease to exist. They need to be completely exterminated. There cannot be any more private finance. There's no other way to rescue the real economy. And then when we're rescuing the real economy, we'll have policies of development within which all disciplines, including architecture, are going to be a part of.
But if we go back to Dorette's question, I think it is a very large, let's say, issue. But I think there are two levels there now in relation to the neoliberal. To how neoliberal policies are applied, because maybe we'll discuss it next week as well. It is a relation between also neoliberal ideology and the actual material conditions and how they come together. And I think there is a big confusion between the two, like how the neoliberal ideology is maintained. And in order to sustain the existing material conditions, but the material conditions are not really addressed. So I think there are different levels there that we need to discuss. There is another question. No, we don't see the welfare state as something that accelerated. Yeah, there is a question by Jose Alves. How do you see the welfare state then as a structure that accelerated the neoliberal project, or something that tried to tame the project? Well, the neoliberal, yeah.
I would just quickly say that we don't read the neoliberalism as a project. We don't read the welfare state as a project. We basically don't.
We tend to say process more than project.
Like both neoliberalism and the welfare state were transient tactics for solving contradictions within capitalism, both structural, political, and political economic contradictions, and political social contradictions. So we read it not as part of neoliberalism, but as like an alternative tactic within capitalism. And there are all kinds of complex contradictions, which we're going to talk about next week.
And a much better socially tactic. I mean, despite the fact that it failed, the welfare state at least was a step towards something positive. So yeah, even if it was, so there was a value in that. It was not that it was just it just failed because it didn't address the structural problems of capitalism.
Yeah, and I just want to make a point on Philip's points in the chat. We do many other things for other reasons that overthrow the existing economic order. Yeah, so there's still architecture at this point. But also the like agency exists not as people, not as architects necessarily, on how to act politically in society. That's a very important point. Although I would say on Philip, on your first point, I think the current condition is that increasingly you can't really do anything without first overthrowing the existing economic order. Like the existing economic order increasingly exists in contradiction with doing any other things, right? That is the problem within which we live today.
We've got another question from Celine. Do you see cryptocurrency becoming a new policy as a solution to the current situation? For example, the correlation between the post-2008 architecture becoming slowly based on trade value and the introduction of non-fungibility to common economics. Yeah, I mean, this is basically what Ricardo was saying. Like the architecture in Manhattan is an NFT, effectively. But this isn't a solution. This is a temporary invention of a place to put money within the bubble. It's just all part of the same bubble. There's no production of value in cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrency is pure speculation, completely unconnected to any real structural solution to the crisis. This is just all the money. I mean, this is kind of complicated and we'll get into it next week. But the economic crisis doesn't mean that there's a lack of money. There's a huge amount of money, a huge amount of capital, accumulated capital. The problem is that there's nowhere to profitably invest it. So things like NFTs, real estate projects, these are created as speculative possibilities for this massive pool of capital to try to find profitability. So similarly with the kind of bizarre mortgage concoctions before 2008, it was a place to invest all this capital that had no other way to find profitability. We're definitely going to get into this next week, though.
You want to connect that to Luke's question next?
Luke says, what opportunities or challenges do you see in architectural practice as it relates to the prospect of a migration to a global digital currency? Do you mean beyond
the Great Reset, exactly.
The Great Reset? Do you want to take this one on? Either of you?
I mean, from our perspective, the Great Reset is not a thing. Or rather, the Great Reset is just a branding exercise for what is already the trend, what is already happening. It's not anyone making a decision to find a solution. It's just an increased detachment of financial markets over the real economy, but at a global level. The global digital currency is not really any solution to any of these issues because these issues exist at a deeper level of the relationship between currency and real economy. Currency is detached from the real economy. Again, we could have a kind of a discussion on like what's the Keynesian take on cryptocurrencies and global the Great Reset discourse, etc. What is the Marxist take on that, etc. Our logic is that these are not real things. Like it doesn't matter if currency is digital or not. Currency is already digital. Like currency today, with the amount of currency that exists in the financial markets, is orders of magnitude above the amount of value that exists in real commodities being traded in the market. Like the financial economy is several levels above, much larger than the real economy. So that separation already happened. The digital currency is not going to change anything. It's just already the trend. So our architectural practice relates to that in the same way that it relates to contemporary problem. Architecture is just going to become NFTs if the current logic persists. But it can persist as well because there was a crash, there's going to be a new one.
We can try to pick up, well, I mean, we're going to pick up on all these aspects of the problem next week when we actually get to talk about what's really going on, rather than kind of like Luke says, great, thanks. Nice. There's another theme we can talk, I think we might talk about a bit on Friday in the final session, is different kinds of political economies around the world and how architecture is involved in them. And then you also get into this question of global capitalism, dollar hegemony, dollar denominated trade globally, the Washington Consensus, the role of imperialism, neocolonialism, and so forth. And architecture is implicated in all those things. But yeah, I think that's beyond the scope today.
Is there a way? Right, mate.
Shall I read the question?
Okay. Yeah. Is there? Yeah, read it. I cannot.
Maria asks, is there a way to reignite the aspirations of the non-aligned movement? I understand the Tricontinental Conference is the continuation of this because it was one of the first utopic political projects in combating the rules set out. Yeah, very good question, and beyond our ability to answer, but we think there is hopefully the potential for a global struggle here, anti-colonial struggle for sure. I think it's something that we want to talk about a bit on Friday with Vivek Chibber joining us, in part just to try to talk about what the role of, or how an architecture school like the AA in the Colonial Center relates to these problems. How do we interpret these geopolitical differences and the history of those differences? But yeah, really big question, important question.
And I'd like to point out here that the architecture developed in the architecture of post-colonial development in the context of the victories of the non-aligned movement from the late 50s onwards, as former colonies began gaining political sovereignty, independence, and started to struggle for economic sovereignty and independence from global systems of colonial trade. There's a very, very large amount of things in common between those development projects and the way architecture functioned in that context, and the way in which the political economy was constructed in those post-colonial nations, and the construction of the welfare state in the first world, and mechanisms of socialist planning and development in the socialist world. So there's a kind of a general kind of global, despite there being essentially three different frameworks, roughly corresponding to first world welfare state, second world socialist development, and third world post-colonial development, there are a series of commonalities in the way political economy functioned to a certain extent, and in the way architecture related to political economy at that time. And all of that is broken in the collapse of the welfare states, in the collapse of the socialist states, in the collapse of the third world movement. So there is a global problem here, yes.
And there are also contradictions between those, like between anti-colonial national liberation movements and Western welfare states. There were serious.
States were trying to prevent independence. Like the nice Labour governments in the UK were nice here, but they were trying to prevent India from being independent at the same time. So this is not smooth and harmonious in any way, shape, or form. There is no kind of global consensus on global liberation. There's a constant struggle. The capitalist regime in the UK is pressured from UK workers to create the welfare state. But then it's pressured from Indian workers to give independence to India, and then India starts constructing its own welfare state mechanisms, right? This is kind of how it goes. It's not the British government that does a welfare state in India. the British government loses control of the colony, and then the Indian people construct their own development mechanisms on their own, according to their own desires and needs, right? So it's a complicated, interesting historical process that is very important to understand, to even basically understand what architecture is in the 20th century and what it can be again.
Yeah, and Maria points out in the chat that the third world movement was stifled by IMF, World Trade Organization, and so on. Yeah. And as well as some internal contradictions that I think Vivek's going to talk about on Friday. Thanks for those points.
And to I suppose, like reinforce the importance of these points at a pure level of a political discussion, I very much think that it is in the what used to be called the third world. Usually today is called the global south. I don't actually like the terminology. I prefer the old one, the one that is slightly less politically correct in the current moment. It is in what is used to be called the third world, and sections of the second world that I believe the way out of the current problem is. And I think there are already trends pointing towards alternative forms of development.
Shall we leave it there, and we'll pick up on these themes, I think, on Friday and then next Tuesday as well. I'd also like to say, just remind everybody that our idea with these events was just to make a start on discussing these things. So we'd like to have meetings at the school to talk about what kind of events to do next year, what themes to look into in more detail. So thanks for everyone's contributions today, and hopefully we can all keep building up this discussion and going into more detail as we go.
Yeah, next year we would very much like to be able to establish some kind of informal work group with everyone who would like to be a part of it, that would develop work on these materials, create discussion sessions on more focused, more specialized on different subtopics, etc. Okay.
Okay.
So
okay. Yeah.
This is great.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. See you on Friday.